I'm not dead. I'm just bad at making videos. This is a paid sponsorship for Clancy's? No, it's not. I'm just hungry, actually. Recently, I made a video about the benefits and drawbacks of martial arts systems. Here's that video. Go watch it first. Now we get to discuss how those systems are created and developed. Because while the martial arts community is currently crazy for systems, that doesn't mean that the systems we churn out are any good. Whether you'll be able to create an effective combat system isn't about how skilled you are, how tough you are, or how many years of experience you have. It's about your methodology. Now, what's a methodology? I'm glad you asked. A methodology is a collection of procedures, rules, and best practices that help to guide a discipline or research. It's essentially a roadmap that allows you to more reliably reach your goal. For example, the scientific method is the methodology used in the natural sciences. In the social sciences, things like interviews, questionnaires, and focus groups are the more common methodologies. In mathematics, they use synthetic and analytic methods. And no, I don't understand that either because I didn't take enough math. But you get the point. Every field needs a set of best practices to guide their research and help them reach more reliable conclusions. It's a way to organize your approach to a problem to help you more consistently find valid solutions. And in martial arts, the solutions to significant problems can often be made into a system. To highlight how important methodologies are to the creation of martial arts systems, let's once again look at the case of John Danaher. Danaher is widely considered the best coach in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and has managed to successfully develop and implement a handful of world-class systems that has led to an unprecedented domination of the sport. Do you know why he's able to do that better than anyone else? Well, before becoming a BJJ coach, John Danaher was a philosophy professor. His area of study involved heuristics, and specifically the history and development of scientific methodologies. John Danaher is a formally trained PhD-level expert in the development of methodologies, which is a qualification that no one else in combat sports has. The rest of the sport addresses problems like martial artists and athletes. Danaher addresses problems like an academic. So if you want to be able to coach like Danaher does, you might have to go get a PhD, but this video is at least a step in the right direction. But hey, it's called martial arts, not martial science, despite Rob's best efforts.
Instead of martial art, is combat science.
So do we really need to spend time thinking about methodologies? Can't martial artists innovate by relying on their years of experience in what works and what doesn't? No! And to drive home that point, may I draw your attention to the endless parade of clowns that teach nonsense. The fact that McDojo Life still has content to upload is pretty good evidence that the common approaches suck. The way the martial arts community creates new systems is often wildly inefficient. I know it's easy to laugh at the fakes and frauds, but your martial art is probably based on the exact same methodology. Yes, even combat sports are often guilty of this. There are still fighters and coaches that claim they're right by citing their years of experience and how many fights they've won. Having years of experience in an industry with no quality control just means you showed up, not that you learned anything. Having 30 years of experience doesn't mean you're good, it just means you're old. And winning fights doesn't necessarily mean that you have a winning strategy. Maybe you were just strong, fast, lucky, or had easy matchups. Maybe you just competed during an era when the opposition was weak. Imagine Tank Abbott competing today. It would not go well. And even if you did win through skill, it doesn't mean you can communicate what you were doing right to other people or understand whether it will work for them. Francis Ngannou is a fantastic fighter, but a mere mortal using the exact same moves would simply not have the same results. The way that most martial artists create systems is a crapshoot. Some of them work, some of them don't, but almost none of them are ideal. So how do you actually make an effective martial arts system using a good methodology? Well, methodologies provide a roadmap to your goal. So the first thing we have to do is iron out what we want our goal to be and what we want our system to do. Do you want to win fights, disarm weapons, inflict damage, or just stay safe? And what kinds of fights do you want to focus on? Combat sports, self-defense encounters, street fights, knife fights, shootouts? Just arguing with your spouse? I don't know. Clearly defining your goal will allow you to accurately measure whether your system fails or succeeds. It will determine the data you gather and the tests you conduct. If you're trying to develop a system of gun disarms, then looking at fistfights isn't a great use of your time. If you want to develop a great striking system, it might look very different depending on whether you adapt it to kickboxing or MMA. The goal of your system is going to determine what methodologies you should consider using. An example of a good goal is consistently land uppercuts from a clinch in Muay Thai rule set. An example of a bad goal is win fights. Which fights? Which rule set? What's your win condition? There's way too many unanswered questions there, and you can't say all the fights, because that doesn't make any sense. The high-level tactics in some rule sets simply don't translate to other rule sets, and they're often illegal. For example, there's zero overlap in ways to win Muay Thai matches and BJJ matches. Trying to win under every rule set is just going to ensure that you lose in all of them. You need to pick. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to give examples of methodologies for the development of a couple different systems. One will revolve around winning competitions with a focus on sport Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and the other will be about self-defense. Now, there are other potential goals, and they can get a lot more specific than the examples I'm giving. But I'm going to use these as examples because they're some of the most common. Of the two, the more straightforward methodology is the one for combat sports, because it has the advantage of allowing you to directly test your system under controlled conditions. However, even combat sports systems are often developed in dumb ways. It's very common that instructors will teach all of their students whichever moves they happen to use. The instructor's particular experiences, personality, body type, past training, and even preferences can strongly dictate what you end up learning. Does your boxing instructor happen to love Aikido? They might find a way to work Aikido in there, even if it's a terrible idea. This means that you're rarely learning from a broadly applicable system, and you are instead learning whatever the instructor feels like teaching. Instead of basing gym-wide systems on our personal experiences, maybe we should do some actual testing. Instead of continuing to talk about hypotheticals, I'm going to give you a real-world example of a martial arts system developed using a good methodology. Defensive BJJ, which I mentioned in my video on systems, is a YouTube channel and BJJ system spearheaded by Britt Mikkelsen. Mikkelsen set the goal of staying safe in sport BJJ based on a set of fundamental positions. Using his existing experience, he developed a rough outline of a system that was then workshopped with students and other practitioners. He then had his students start to implement the system in competitions, slowly adding to and adjusting the system based on the successes and failures that they encountered. And the best part is that much of this process is documented on the Defensive BJJ YouTube page. Now, that's the simple series of events as I understand them. But let's look at those actions through a methodological lens. Mikkelsen formed a hypothesis and then sought the opinions of other practitioners. By teaching the system to his class, he effectively created a focus group that was able to give feedback and further refine the system. Then he posted the basics of the system online, which allowed the larger BJJ community to examine it, learn it, and provide further feedback, effectively creating a soft peer review of his system. Having various students use the system in competition provided an opportunity to test it in a controlled environment with limited variables, while still using a respectable sample size and making sure that everyone is doing their best. Mikkelsen even calls the people that use his system in competition his research team, which shows that he is doing this intentionally.
Today we announce the Defensive BJJ Competition Research Team.
Then, Mikkelsen and his students used the results and the feedback from the test subjects to refine the system, before continuing to test it in ever higher level competitions. Mikkelsen created a focus group, got feedback from peers, and is now implementing the classic scientific method by going through a cycle of subjecting his system to progressively more difficult tests, while using the results and the perspective of the combatants to further expand and refine the system. and his YouTube channel effectively serves as open access documentation of the entire process. This is a brilliant and disciplined way of creating a martial arts system. Mickelson's combination of open information, testing, and impressive documentation serves as an excellent case study in how to develop an effective system. Mickelson did not simply teach the moves that he happened to like. He spent time, effort, and money to make sure he created a system that is both well-tested and broadly applicable. The use of focus groups and informal debriefs, mixed with classic scientific method testing cycles, shows how combat sports are able to use a mix of social and natural science methodologies. And note that Mickelson is limiting his testing only to what fulfills his goal. He's not advertising his system for MMA or self-defense because he understands the methodology he's used revolves solely around sport BJJ. While many other instructors might be using a similar process, defensive BJJ at least counts as much better than average. Now, the lack of a control group or objective measures for success and failure means that Mickelson's approach isn't quite good science in an academic sense, but it's still a giant step forward in open information and documentation. While this documentation does prevent defensive BJJ from being a secret weapon exclusive to Mickelson's gym, it does encourage much greater development and refinement, leading to a better overall system. Thanks to Mickelson's improvements in methodological testing and peer review, defensive BJJ is likely the most successful defensive grappling system in the sport. However, exactly which methodologies you use may depend on what resources you have access to. For example, when John Danaher began teaching students, he was at Renzo Gracie Academy, which was already a world-class school filled with competitive athletes. As a result, Danaher was able to test his systems against the highest levels of competition without ever leaving his home gym, which is a luxury that most coaches don't have. Once those advantages were combined with Danaher's formal training in testing and scientific scrutiny, the development of a world-class system was practically a foregone conclusion. Coaches without those advantages are forced to find more roundabout ways of testing. For example, Britt Mickelson has offered to pay the competition fees of any black belt willing to test his system, which could be a great way to increase his sample size.
We are looking for black belts and no-gi expert division competitors who are willing to sacrifice themselves to test the system. Go into competitions to experiment with certain strategies and techniques as planned by a research team.
However, the thread of continuity running through all combat sports methodologies is that it should be a simplified version of the scientific method. Ask a question, form a hypothesis, test the hypothesis, revise the hypothesis, create a better test, repeat. Your question should be the goal you're seeking to achieve. How do I reliably land an armbar? How do I defend against strikes in the clinch? How do I disarm a knife-wielding attacker? Etc. The question that you ask and the goal you're trying to achieve are essentially the same thing. Then you form a hypothesis. Come up with a rough draft of an answer that you could feasibly test. Once you test it, either reject or revise your hypothesis to try and improve on what you came up with. Then recruit more people to perform more tests and keep expanding out from there. Pretty much all systems in combat sports should be developed in a way very similar to this. Now let's compare the methods used in combat sports to how we might gather data for something like a self-defense system. Presumably, we would want this system to be able to take away someone's ability to attack you while keeping you safe and being broadly applicable to many different body types and situations. While this seems to be the goal of virtually every martial art, self-defense systems are notoriously ineffective and filled with charlatans. To understand this, let's take a brief detour to examine how the typical self-defense curriculum is often developed. Some guy that claims he's won a bunch of unverifiable street fights offers to teach people the small set of moves that work for him. First of all, no one can independently verify that that guy actually won all those fights. Taking someone at their word is a bad way to gather empirical knowledge because people lie. I know that should be obvious to anyone who's ever been on the internet before, but I felt I should say it anyway. Now, even if by some miracle someone is telling the truth about all the street fights they've won, how do you verify they actually won using the system they're selling you? And even if they actually did, there's no reason to believe that that system would work for anyone else. Some people are significantly bigger, stronger, faster, more explosive, or more durable than the average person. Anyone with a great attribute is naturally going to develop a system or style that leans on that attribute, meaning that anyone without that specific advantage might not be able to use that system at all. Someone basing conclusions on their own personal experiences is called anecdotal evidence, and it proves absolutely nothing. Saying, I use this system and won a fight, so this system works in fights, is equivalent to, I did cocaine and cured my cancer, so cocaine cures cancer. That's not even a correlation, it's just a random coincidence. At best, these self-defense systems incorporate the testimonies of students that claim to have used the system in a self-defense situation, but that rarely makes the system any better. Having a second piece of anecdotal evidence does not mean you have a statistic, it just means that you were dumb twice. I know I'm really over-explaining this, but I've seen some incredibly stupid people in my comment sections, so I wanted to cover my bases. But what's an alternative to anecdotal evidence? We can't exactly test our self-defense system by starting a bunch of street fights because that's A, illegal, B, immoral, and C, really stupid. But there are tons of scientific disciplines that can't directly run experiments, and they still find ways to gather evidence. Natural sciences often deal with immutable physical laws and can therefore make great use of the scientific method. However, self-defense is a lot more about human behavior. Sure, anatomy and biology play an important part in any fight, but it probably won't give us the whole picture. Social sciences, on the other hand, deal with human psychology and the relationships between individuals. It sounds like any violent encounter is going to be a combination of these disciplines. So how can we use scientific methodologies to figure out self-defense? First of all, we can look at police reports of assaults and street fights. What sequence of events unfolded, and what was the outcome of the encounter? The reports might reveal some differences in the actions taken by people that won and people that lost. We can then compare that evidence to medical records to search for patterns between injuries sustained and outcomes observed. This could tell us what kind of attacks on what kind of targets are likely to change the course of an encounter. We compare this to statements and surveys completed by both combatants and witnesses, and pretty soon we start to put together a picture of what attributes, tools, and actions dictates who wins and who loses. And more weight should be given to fights that were filmed, because that gives us a way to independently verify many of the claims made in the questionnaires and official reports, all while keeping in mind that our data may be skewed due to the file drawer effect. You can then give all of this data to a team knowledgeable in sports science, psychology, trauma medicine, and self-defense law, and they can likely start to piece together a set of actions and conditions that can more reliably lead a practitioner towards their goal. These moves can then be given to athletes, martial artists, and educators that can start to weave them together into a coherent, teachable system. And this focus on data collection might seem like an unreasonable burden to place on someone that wants to teach a new self-defense system, but this idea is not without precedent. A few years ago, the selfdefenseexpert.com published an article that provided statistics on 250 knife attacks caught by CCTV. And the channel Active Self-Protection regularly makes videos and gives talks based on the findings of literally thousands of violent altercations. These are some of the rare examples of people doing self-defense research correctly, even if their methods of data collection aren't the highest possible standard. While anyone can categorize the type of interaction happening in a video, researchers also need to be educated on the potential pitfalls and biases that can skew their data. For example, any study that exclusively examines CCTV footage is going to be incomplete. Ask yourself, what kinds of interactions are likely to be caught on camera? Generally, the ones in public spaces. This means that the data is going to include a much higher percentage of stranger-on-stranger violence and a much lower percentage of domestic violence, meaning that anyone that gathers or presents this data to a general audience has to be cognizant of potential weaknesses in their research. Now, if you're noticing that methodologies for creating a reliable self-defense system involves a lot more academic research and data analysis than it does martial arts, then you're now starting to understand why the systems we currently have are hot garbage. Because the Venn diagram between martial artists and academics does not have a whole lot of overlap. So when someone claims that their system is based on science, ask them about their data collection methods and what statistical models they used. If they can't show you some graphs, then they probably lied about the science part. Graphs and flowcharts, that's what gets my motor going. My dirty talk is about data analysis. Now, obviously, hiring a team of data scientists is a pretty high burden to place on anyone. But when we look at the self-defense expert and active self-protection, we can see that you don't need Harvard-level data science to learn valuable lessons. Any careful analysis of any information that you can readily access can still be really helpful. However, the better your data collection and analysis is, the more definitively you get to state your conclusions. Active self-protection especially is really good about putting qualifiers into his statements about exactly what his depth of research is able to tell us. You don't have to be a formally trained data scientist. You just need to put in the work to let the data guide your conclusions. Or, at the very least, learn to tell the difference between the people making claims and the people doing research.
Hey, future me here. Just needed to quickly clarify that while data is extremely helpful for the development of strategies, building personal skills still needs to be done in a force-on-force environment. Just in case someone got the bright idea that the only thing they need for self-defense is to look at some graphs. The data can help guide your development of systems and strategies, but these systems still need to be tested in a force-on-force environment.
Now, let's briefly compare some of the methodologies for combat sports and self-defense. While combat sports can directly test a system under controlled conditions, self-defense arts likely have to rely on at least some real-world data to look for correlations. Combat sports tend to lend themselves to a kind of trial and error, in which repeated and controlled testing often develops the best fighters. Self-defense, however, does not have the option for repeated or reliable testing in a vacuum, and instead needs to rely on data to inform strategies before that kind of pressure testing is implemented. While data collection can be very helpful to combat sports by providing a more objective measure of success and failure, and as a way to form a hypothesis, it's much more critical to self-defense systems, as it's really the only way to measure success and failure at all. So if you really want to develop a self-defense system, taking data science classes is probably going to be a better use of your time than Krav Maga. Also, remember the examples I gave might be a good guideline, but they're not necessarily the only possible methodologies. For example, you could use a real-world data methodology for combat sports as well, by analyzing the moves and strategies that disproportionately win fights. While we can't say there's one correct methodology, we do have to be cognizant of what practices and methods we use to judge effectiveness. Before you spend your time and money learning a system, ask yourself whether that system was founded on an effective methodology. And if you want to create a new system, you have to start by clearly defining your goal and then asking yourself which methodologies would prove or disprove a system or strategy's validity. If martial artists put a bit more thought into how systems are developed, innovation will be faster and frauds will be easier to spot. After all, if you want to advertise your system as martial science or the science of self-defense, then you had better actually be doing something scientific.